Good afternoon, I'm Annica Walz.
Hi, I'm Olivia Agnelli.
For our religious freedom case assignment, we chose to do the case Walz versus Tax Commission of the City of New York, which was a case decided in 1970. So the case Walz versus Tax Commission of the City of New York addressed the question on whether or not providing a tax exemption to religious organizations violated the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment.
All right, so before we jump into the case, let's first take a look on what the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment is and why it actually matters to us American citizens. So to understand this case a little better, we're going to go over the meaning of what the First Amendment is. It is Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or those of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievance. So the three elements of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment are: it prohibits the government from establishing and promoting a religion. This helps to ensure separation between the churches and the state. Second, it prevents the government from creating an official religion and favoring one religion over another. Thirdly, it prohibits the government from preferring religion over non-religion.
So now let's jump into the case summary. In the case of Walz versus Tax Commission of the City of New York, the plaintiff, Frederick Walz, whom was a property owner and a taxpayer, was so concerned on where his tax dollars were being used, he took his issue all the way to the United States Supreme Court. The plaintiff, Frederick Walz, sued the New York City Tax Commission, arguing that the property tax exemption granted to churches and religious organizations had violated the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. He claimed that as a taxpayer, he felt as if he was being indirectly forced to support religion through these government tax exemptions. This case raised a big question on whether or not exempting religious organizations from property taxes showed that the government was endorsing or supporting a religion.
All right, so the parties that are involved in the case are the plaintiff, Frederick Walz, and the defendant, the tax commissioner of the City of New York. So the plaintiff's defense, Frederick Walz, he is a concerned property owner and taxpayer from Staten Island. He felt like that this tax exemption was unfair, so he sued the City of New York. He believed that the churches being exempted from the tax break violated the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. He then claimed in the case that as a taxpayer, he felt like he was being forced to indirectly support religion. And the defendant, the tax commissioner of New York, their defense is they felt like that that they did not break the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. These people are responsible for bringing the tax exemptions and assessments to the state, so they are the ones responsible for putting the exemption on churches.
So now moving into Frederick Walz, the plaintiff and the taxpayer in the New York City, he filed a lawsuit against the New York City Tax Commission, and his argument was that granting property tax exemptions to churches and religious organizations had violated the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, which prohibits the government from creating or favoring any religion. Frederick Walz felt as a taxpayer he's being indirectly forced to support religion, and it was against his will.
Right, so the tax commission of the City of New York's argument is that they defended the exemption. It was part of a broad policy that they had brought upon. It was not only for religious groups, but it was also for public education systems and charities. The tax commissioner also claimed that this wasn't an endorsement. There was no money being transferred from one to another, but this was a neutral exemption fairly applied to all nonprofits throughout New York.
So the result in this trial, or the outcome result in the trial for the case of Walz versus Tax Commission of the New York City, was that the court ruled 7-1 against Frederick Walz, ruling in favor with the New York City Tax Commission. The court had found that the defendant was not in violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, and the court decided that the tax exemptions were not seen as a government support of religion or religious organizations, because it also applied to other nonprofit organizations such as schools, hospitals, and charities. And not having a tax exemptions for religious organizations would overall lead to more of an entanglement with the government and religion. And this not having the tax exemptions creates a separation between the churches and states.
All right, so a few basic facts on Walz versus the Tax Commission. This case upheld the tax exempt status of churches. The purpose of the exemption from the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment is to support nonprofit organizations by exempting them from paying these taxes. It is not to promote religion. The exemption also would cause more of an entanglement by requiring the government to monitor these religious groups if that tax exemption wasn't put on.
So we're gonna move on to some random facts about this case. First of all, it was appeal from the Court of Appeals of the state of New York. This case, Walz versus Tax Commission of the City of New York, was the first time the U.S. Supreme Court had kind of ruled and dealt with a case involving a tax exemption for churches, which helped to define the policy through the nation and rule between the separation of government and religion. And then something else about this case is it also later helped to establish the foundation for something called the Lemon Test, which helped evaluate cases like this using these 3 elements, and they are purpose, effect, and entanglement.
All right, so moving on to the legal issues related to religious freedom within the Walz versus the Tax Commissioner case. This case dealt with the big question of whether or not our property tax exemptions violated the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. Walz believed that allowing the churches to be exempt, these taxes violated the Establishment Clause, and he felt indirectly forced to support religion. However, the Supreme Court did not agree with Walz at all. They argued that offering these tax breaks to churches wasn't about supporting religion, but more so treating all nonprofits, organizations equally to one another. Many other nonprofit organizations received this tax break that the churches received, so the church looked at this as fair. The court also said that this helps to keep the government out of religious matters, which also protects religious freedom.
So moving on to whether we agree or disagree with the court. For me, I say I agree with the U.S. Supreme Court's decision to rule against Walz. The court had said that the purpose of the exemption was not to promote religion, but to treat these religious groups the same as other nonprofit organizations, such as hospitals and schools. So to me, that showed a pretty neutral and fair decision of the court. Also, this has been an exemption in America for over 200 years, so why would we change it now?
Yeah, so I'm kind of going to follow up with what Annica said. I also agree with the court's decision in favor of the tax commissioner. In this case, it was stated multiple times that there were other nonprofit organizations involved in the tax exemption, meaning the government was just trying to give these organizations and charities, hospitals, schools, a little bit of a tax break. And honestly, it's to have less control, in my opinion. And I also think when there's less control when it comes to government and religion, it's honestly for the best. And lastly, Mr. Walz just didn't convince me with his defense. His defense was he felt indirectly forced to support religion when that was not the case. There was also other nonprofits involved, as we said before.
Yes, and we will link our sources below. And thank you so much for watching.
Thank you.
Bye.